United Nations is a screamo supergroup whose roots go back to at least 2005. They consider screamo power violence as their main influence. History Formation and early recording sessions. United Nations was started by Jeff Rickley, the vocalist-lyricist of the band Thursday. Other artists initially involved in the project possibly included Daryl Palumbo, vocalist of Glassjaw and Head Automatica, and Ben Collar, drummer for Converge. However, all members except for Rickley were under contracts with other record labels and were not legally permitted to work in projects released by another label, making it difficult for the official lineup to be well known. Since Rickley is the only member whose primary band is currently not under contract, his name is the only one that can legally appear in press materials. Press photos of the band released in 2008 depict 4 people wearing Ronald Reagan masks. The idea of the side project can be traced back to the early 2000s, but it was not until 2008 that United Nations took shape. In 2008, the band recorded enough material for 2 studio albums, 2 extended plays, and 1 parody album that would be released at some point. The band was uncertain if these would be the only releases by the band, or if the band will regroup to record more songs. Debut album and EP. United Nations released their self-titled debut on September 9, 2008, through Eyeball Records. The band was ready to release the album with essentially the same photo cover for the iconic cover of the Beatles' Abbey Road, with the exception of the Beatles engulfed in flames and walking to the left rather than the right. When stores began refusing to sell the album, pressing was halted with 1,000 albums already made. These were sold exclusively through the Eyeball Records web store, and it was later released with a different cover. The album received minor success, and while it didn't chart on the Billboard 200, it did chart at number 44 on the Billboard Independent Albums and number 14 on the Billboard Top Heatseekers. The vinyl pressing of the album was intended to include a Kidz Bop version of their self-titled album, titled United Nations Plays Pretty for a Bunch of Fucking Babies. However, recordings of this album were lost. At the time, United Nations detailed several possible future releases that were already recorded. One included a 7-inch EP that was released on Deathish Incorporated titled Nevermind the Bombings, Here's Your Six Figures, which was expected to face similar copyright issues due to the title and cover's parody of the Sex Pistols album Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols. Also announced, but not released as of 2014, a 10-inch vinyl EP titled Music for Interchanging Parts to be released on Temporary Residence, which features 1 song in many parts, and a studio album titled Dark Side of the Union. United Nations played their first show on January 20, 2009, the day of Barack Obama's presidential inauguration. He played alongside Anti-Flag, Darkest Hour, Ruiner, and the AKAS in Washington, D.C. The next 4 years. Exactly 4 years after their first show, United Nations performed live on January 20, 2013, in Washington, D.C. with Old Lines and Black Clouds. In October-November 2013, United Nations toured the eastern U.S. with Pianos Become the Teeth and Circle Takes the Square. The lineup for this tour featured Rickley, Jonah Bayer, Lucas Previn, and David Haig and Zach Sewell. United Nations released their second studio album, The Next 4 Years, on July 14, 2014 through Temporary Residence Limited. The release of the album was preceded by a stream of Serious Business. Following the release, the band toured the U.S. in August 2014. Before United Nations' Brooklyn set in August 2014, Jonah Bayer's sister and Saturday Night Live cast member Vanessa Bayer came on stage and roasted the band. Influences and genre. Musically, United Nations takes influence from mid-1990s screamo, hardcore punk, powerviolence, and post-hardcore bands such as Refused, Nation of Ulysses, Orchid, Majority Rule, Fugazi, Reversal of Man, and bands signed to Gravity Records or Abolition Records. Their genre is also often described as grindcore. United Nations pays tribute to the bands from which they take their influence from in their albums. On their self-titled debut album, The song titled The Shape of Punk That Never Came pays tribute to Refused's album The Shape of Punk to come most notably in the lyric Dennis, are you listening? Is there something that I'm missing? Which is directed toward Dennis Leicht's copyright N, the lead singer of Refused. The album United Nations Plays Pretty for a Bunch of Fucking Babies was inspired by Nation of Ulysses' album Plays Pretty for Baby. Lyrically, United Nations has songs that feature both comical songs with assistance from comedy group Stella and comedian Chris and Scal, and also songs that about social and political values. More specifically, United Nations was inspired by bands that raised questions about political corruption, social inequity, personal responsibility and artistic freedom in opposition to bands that are more concerned with pop culture. Jeff Wrigley commented on his vision for the band. Controversies. Before its release, stores refused to sell the band's debut self-titled album because of trademark issues. As a result, only 1,000 copies were made with the controversial cover, and later copies were made with an alternative cover. The 1,000 original copies were sold exclusively through the band and Eyeball Records. The actual international organization, United Nations, after which the band is named, discovered that a musical group had formed under the name of United Nations, and ordered Facebook to remove their official page. After deleting their page, Facebook informed the band about the removal and also stated, the use of the name United Nations by the band and the use of its logo which resembles the UN emblem has not been authorized and violates international and United States laws. The band's record label comically responded the situation stating, the United Nations, an international organization of some kind, has been taking issue with the band that shares its name. Who had the name first remains open to debate, but the problem exists nonetheless. Their label also hinted at the possibility of no longer being able to release their debut album. In December 2008, a little over a month after the band's Facebook was deleted, their MySpace page was also deleted. Members, due to the nature of the band, it is unclear who exactly is a member of United Nations at any given time. Early promotional images of the band depicted 4 people wearing Ronald Reagan masks, and all contributors were contractually obligated to remain anonymous. The only member not under contract was Jeff Wrigley of the band Thursday, for press and media purposes. However, Jonah Bayer and Lucas Previn later became publicly announced members of United Nations as well. Many sources claim that Daryl Palumbo, Ben Collar, and also members of various bands signed to Eyeball Records contributed to United Nations. The cease and desist letter sent to the band by the actual United Nations to Facebook to remove the band's profile listed approximately 30 people who the government entity suspected as being band members at the time. In a 2008 interview with Wrigley, he discussed the inclusion of non-instrument playing members, such as the comedy group Stella and comedian Chris and Scal who helped write lyrics, and the creators of Homestar Runner who acted as directors for the band. In a 2013 interview with Wrigley, he elaborated on the revolving lineup of United Nations, stating, the reason that we've been able to kind of get away with playing when we want to is because we change members and because we've never copyrighted any of the songs to any member. So, it's really hard to say who made what and who was just playing in United Nations for a little while. That's something that has protected us the anonymity of the band, the changing nature of the band it's like, well I was only in it for a little while, and then it was these guys, and then it was these guys, and then it was these guys. In the same interview, managing editor of Alternative Press Scott Heisel asked Wrigley if, because he is the only well-known member of United Nations, he was afraid of taking the full blame for any of the band's controversial or potentially illegal activity. He responded, I don't feel like many bands take chances anymore. There's a lot of talk about being punk and revolutionary and this and that, but it's also awfully safe. Europunk seems awfully safe to me now, so I like the idea of doing something that's actually dangerous. List of members and verifiable contributions Discography Release date announced Studio albums, United Nations, The Next 4 Years. EPs, Nevermind the Bombings, Here's Your 6 Figures 7 Inches, Illegal Union. Release date TBA United Nations have announced several releases that the group has intended to release at one point, but have not been given a formal release date. United Nations plays Pretty for a Bunch of Fucking Babies, The Dark Side of the Union, Music for Interchanging Parts 10 Inches, Stole the Past, Fucked the Future 7. References. External links, official site, United Nations on AbsolutePunk.net, Power Violence band United Nations frontman Jeff Rickley urges followers to drop cameras, pick up rocks, get active.